When we sit down and we ask ourselves, what is the city of the future and why Durban and why is Durban important to this discourse? For me, it's not so much about Durban, although it is. To me, it's about a city which is grappling with rituals and difference in a very unique and special way. A city which plays a very particular socio-economic role in terms of the geography of South Africa. South Africa being a country which is almost at the nexus of the sort of BRICS dialogue, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And how does an African country locate itself in that bigger discourse where the world is changing and the world is shifting? So cities become an increasingly important way of understanding how nations begin to navigate their resources, how identity is shaped, how we define ourselves. There's a bigger question about social integration. There's a bigger issue about how do people's livelihoods occupy and claim this territory of the city. And rituals become very, very important because rituals connect us to our past, to our present, to our future. The question of how we celebrate life, death, marriage, the changing of relationships becomes very important to our sense of humanity. And because of these population pressures, I think difference is going to be an increasingly important factor in terms of how people begin to navigate the city. When you take a place like Durban with its range of cultures, its range of sort of class groups, the fact that it is working on the back of an apartheid city, so the whole logic of the geographical separation of people according to race, class, economy, etc., access to resources, it means that the architect is placed in a very difficult position today because how do we make cities and how do we make architecture that can respond to these challenges, create amenable places which are suitable for everybody, but you have different rituals, you have different cultures, the narrative of traditional rites, traditional practices coexisting with very contemporary and, let's say, modern conditions. A world where we have aspiration of a consumer society, so the shopping center becomes the new type of public space. But at the same time, the notion of a cemetery, which is the antithesis of a shopping center, is also a type of gathering place. And it's super fascinating because as human beings, we oscillate from these conditions of wanting clothes, the Audi, the shoes, the look, the feel. And then every now and again, something happens in our lives which brings us back to earth, which reminds us of a sort of cosmic relationship. So when a child is born, when somebody dies, and there's something quite fascinating about the cemetery. It's right in the heart of the city, close to a public transport interchange, close to an informal market. But even within itself, it has its own geographies of separation. So the differences between different Christian groups and how they were buried, the sort of demarcation for people of a Jewish background. So in a strange way, the cemetery is a microcosm of the geography of separation which defines South Africa as a whole. But at the same time, it's a place of ritual. People come frequently to remember the dead, to engage with themselves and so on. And this sort of elastic continuum between commerce and memory, between consumption and the imagination, this is the sort of social imaginary of the city that I think architects need to design for, they need to tap into, they need to make cities meaningful. What's fascinating to me is when one begins to look at places like the beachfront and the extensive and amazing work that was done with regards to 2010 and the World Cup, is beginning to see how people are occupying that site in a different sort of way, where there's a sense of a formal economy that exists there, but there's also a sense of an informal social economy, a place where people of different groups and different backgrounds can interact without having the burden of commerce in their face. And if you look at these three conditions, they're a broader story for cities in the future that oscillate between the sacred spaces, the profane spaces, spaces of ritual, and cities which have to engage with difference. Which leaves me with my last question. What does the architect do to marry these different concerns in a way that is meaningful for future generations? If I had the answer, I don't know if I'd be an architect, I'd be God.